Welcome in this second part of this Godzilla retrospective on the Heisei era, so Heisei era which starts in 1984 on which lasts until 1995. Heisei era, which is actually one of the shortest of all the Godzilla era with only 7 films, but I must confess it's actually one of my favorite. And for several reasons. One is that there is some kind of continuity from one film to another. It may be a bit vague sometimes from one film to the other, but there is some kind of continuity. There is an evolution, something which happens in a film has an impact on the following one. That brings some kind of fairly well-handled consistency from the beginning to the end. And you also have great special effects and some of the classical flaws of the Godzilla films, but which, in my opinion, are not that problematic. I mean, it is a problem on some film. It will lead to some kind of frustration, but in general, I would say it managed to deliver the goods. So let's not wait any further, and let's start with the reboot made in 1984, the Return of Godzilla, directed by Koji Hashimoto. Koji Hashimoto, who is not a stranger to the Godzilla universe because he was the assistant director to Ishiro Honda on several Godzilla films, namely King Kong vs Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Invasion of Astro Monster, and he was kind of the go-to guy from Toho when special effects were involved. He also handled the assistant direction of the submersion of Japan, so a big special effects film from the 1970s, which was an adaptation of a bestseller. And just before taking charge of this Return of Godzilla, he actually directed a science fiction film called Sayonara Jupiter, Bye Bye Jupiter, which is an attempt by Toho to do something a bit in the 2001-2010 spirit, so something quite ambitious when it comes to science fiction, with more on the realistic side rather than the space opera side. Once again, here that was an adaptation of a popular science fiction Japanese book. Unfortunately, the film is far from great, but it has some really good special effects. I think that's the main saving grace of this Sayonara Jupiter. But otherwise, the film was a disaster to many on many sides. But whatever, he was obviously experienced with special effects. He was experienced with the Godzilla universe, so it made sense for Toho to give him the direction of this reboot for the 30 years anniversary of Godzilla. I use the word reboot, and indeed when you watch the very beginning of the film, the first 15-20 minutes, it's basically a remake of the original 1954 Godzilla by Ishiro Honda. So you have the same concept of a boat which has been under nuclear radiation, the mystery about what happened there, the arriving of the giant monster that is Godzilla. So all this tend to be in the direct legacy of the original 1954 Godzilla film. But then it gets more interesting because they update it with the geopolitical situation of the time. We may forget it maybe nowadays, but in 1984 there was a big tension during the Cold War between the USSR and the USA. We tend to think that the Cuba Missile Crisis was the worst time of the Cold War, and to some extent that was true, but the early 80s were also extremely tensed, and we barely escaped a nuclear war there. If you are interested in the subject, I advise you to research things like the Able Archer NATO exercise on Operation Ryan by the KGB. Those things were in conjunction and really brought the world to a brink. At the same time, you also had the fairly famous story of the the fake signal of an attack on the USSR, on the officer in charge who refused to signal it as an attack, who thought that was a bug, that was a problem in the software, and who was right, but for that reason he ended up being fired from the Soviet army. So there was basically a bit like what happened in John Badham's War Game, this kind of situation. So all these things happened during the early 80s, and so there was a real tension between the US and the USSR around that time. And so for Godzilla 1984, Return of Godzilla, they chose to incorporate these aspects with basically Japan being stuck in the middle between these two superpowers who are trying to tell Japan what to do, and so Japan who tries to find in its own way, because they are the one who are directly concerned, because Godzilla is the one who appears in their country. They have to deal with it, and you have so the USSR, the USA, who are pushing for using a nuclear bomb on Godzilla, on Japan, who doesn't want to do that and tries to find another way. And so that puts in an interesting light the position of Japan during this Cold War era, being more on the American side, obviously, but still being under pressure on kind of trying to find its own way in this difficult situation, and not being completely at the mercy of any of those two superpowers. And that was kind of the case back then, even if, as I said, it was more leaning to the American side, obviously, but there was certainly some attempt or will from a good part of the population, maybe a bit less from the politicians, but of the population, to maybe be a bit less dependent on the US as well. And so all this is quite skillfully incorporated in the story of the Return of Godzilla. You also have a bit of some glimpse of what will be in the future in a film like Shin Godzilla. So more than 30 years later, with Shin Godzilla, so you have all this idea of how a government, the Japanese government, can face this crisis. I mean, the real discussion between the ministry, between the different authorities, all these kind of things going on. And you have a little bit of that here in Godzilla 1984, in a less developed way, and with a more geopolitical, international geopolitical angle. You have some interesting ideas with the use of the satellite which have some nuclear missile, which is an idea basically taken from the 1970s or early 80s Meteor film with Sean Connery, if I remember correctly, which was partially shot in Hong Kong, actually. And so they use this idea of having some satellite with a nuclear missile, and one of them is going to be sent to the Earth. And I kind of like this idea of this kind of super weaponized satellite. That was kind of an idea of the time, basically, probably because of the Star Wars concept that was taking shape in the US back then under Reagan. But that's an idea which was in the moment. You also had a similar idea, for example, in Akira, Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira, with the Sol satellite, which was using a laser beam instead of a nuclear missile. But anyway, all these ideas are pretty well used in this Godzilla, and gives a more interesting context and bring some relevance to its time. The only problem when it goes to this direction is that the execution may be a bit lacking, especially when it comes to the Western actors involved. That's a classic flow of Asian films, not just in Japan, but also in Hong Kong, China, Korea, a bit everywhere, basically. As soon as the filmmakers, they are using Western actors, well, first they tend not to use the best of the crop, There is always some kind of weird vibe when there are interactions between these two sets of actors, the Western ones and the Asian ones. And so here, when you have these meetings between the USSR representative, the US representative, and the Japanese prime minister, sometimes it does feel a bit awkward. It doesn't flow really naturally, but still, the idea is still strong enough that you will find it interesting nevertheless, despite this lacking execution. When it comes to Godzilla himself, he's actually pretty good here. They have really remade, re-engineered the suit, the Godzilla suit, and it's much better than what we had to deal with in the end of the Showa era. This Godzilla is massive. It really has a more aggressive outlook and is kind of back to its original essence, which is a giant monster who is basically threatening humanity. So we are really back to its original idea of 1954, and no longer this concept of being the friend of the children, the friend of Japan, and the one who helped nature. So all this idea which had evolved in the Showa era, which had kind of taken shape during the end of the 60s and the 70s, are basically thrown in the bin with this Return of Godzilla, and we get back to the original aggressive, destructive Godzilla, and that's certainly for the best. There is only one flaw when it comes to Godzilla itself, in my opinion, and that's a flaw which was already present in the previous era, which are his eyes. Once again, the eyes feels more like some golf ball or table tennis balls, and they lack expressivity, and they look a bit awkward and weird, and so that's the only flaw when it comes to the incarnation of this Godzilla here, and it's unfortunate. They will fortunately correct it in the following ones, but it doesn't completely negate the good impression that this new Godzilla make. It's still a bit disappointing, but not too much. We can deal with it. It's basically only when you are dealing with close-up that you really notice that the eyes are not right. But that doesn't happen that often, and usually when you have wide shots, there is really no problem. This Godzilla looked actually really good. And you have what you can expect from this kind of film, so big destruction here, mostly of Tokyo. The final of the film takes place in Shinjuku, and there is really a lot of care which has been put in the miniature, in the special effects in general, and it looks really good on the screen. You also have some interesting way of using the army. They have some special weapons there, which is something I appreciate. I think I already say that when it comes to the Godzilla, I like to have the humanity active, and not just having some kaiju fights and that's it. I want my human characters to do something. I want the army to be able to come up with strategies and stuff, and there is a bit of that here with some special weapon, and especially with some kind of spaceship, which is called here the Super X, which doesn't have a great design, but the concept, the idea of having this spaceship which can kind of fight on an equal footing or almost equal footing with Godzilla, I think is a good idea, and that makes for more dynamic destruction action scene, because there is this stake of, is Godzilla going to manage to destroy this Super X, or will this Super X manage to make enough damage on Godzilla? So there is a bit more of stakes, as I said here, during those action scenes. I especially like the final actually of the film, because there is a very interesting lightning. It takes place during the night, and the light in the background is very red, and so it gives some kind of a post-apocalyptic vibe here, which I think is very adequate for a Godzilla film. It makes for some very striking image, and the fact that you have this giant monster really destroying with credibility, this iconic area of Tokyo. It is very efficient, it's very graphic, and it makes for a strong impression to end this Godzilla 1984, this Return of Godzilla. So a pretty good reboot, a pretty good start to this new era of Godzilla, to the Heisei era with Return of Godzilla. Surprisingly enough, while the film was pretty good when it comes to its artistic quality, and it was a fairly good success at the box office in Japan as well, it took to a bit long in order to do a sequel, and we only got the second film of this Heisei saga in 1984 with Godzilla Vs Biollante, directed by Kazuki Omori. Here we actually start at the very end of Godzilla 1984 with some people trying to get some cells from Godzilla, cells which are actually smuggled to a Middle East country in which there are some kind of research being made by a Japanese scientist. Those research aimed at transforming the desert into something much more lively, with forest, with vegetation, so completely terraform the desert and makes it a much more livable place. And so that's how it goes, but unfortunately there are some terrorist attacks taking place there, and the daughter of the main scientist is killed in the process. A bit later, this scientist is back in Japan. Godzilla reappears and starts wreaking havoc, and so this scientist is being asked by the government to use the original cells which had been taken in 1984 in order to use them against Godzilla. But turns out that he actually used those Godzilla cells with some raw cell and also with what was left of his daughter, and so in doing so he creates a new monster named Biollante. So as you can see from this quick sum up of the story, it's a bit complex, a bit too ambitious in a way for a Godzilla film. It takes quite a while actually to establish all which is happening in the film. And you have many, once again, foreigners being involved with some corporation trying to fight each other, which are trying to steal their secrets, and you have those Middle East people also involved, and so there is a lot going on there. And once again, as you have quite a few Western actors, the result is quite uneven. When it comes to the flow of this Godzilla vs Biollante, you also have the classical Godzilla flow, I would say, which is that most of the characters in the film are really just based on their function. I mean, they just are there as what they are supposed to be in the story. So here you have the scientist. Here you have the journalist. You have several people like this who are really just defined by their function, by their job, and they are otherwise completely without personality by themselves. There are some attempts to do something a bit more with them, but it just falls flat, and you have some very long conversations where the character basically explain some elements of the story, and there is no passion here. It's just no emotions. It's just making the story clearer for the audience and having things moving forward. And so it lacks. It clearly lacks feelings and real emotions there, which is a classical problem in many of the Godzilla films, which is especially problematic, I think, in Godzilla vs Biollante, because you have actually the main plot, the main aspect of the story is the love that there is between this father scientist and his daughter. He doesn't want to let go of her, and so he ends up creating this giant monster in the process. And so with such a concept, there should be an emphasis on love, on the moral dilemma that there is in creating such a creature based on this kind of feelings. Is it actually proper to do that? So all these questions are there in the background, but they are not really dealt with the emotions that would be really necessary to make it touching for the audience. Yeah, on a similar concept, actually, I think that the Pat Labor 3 was much more successful on that aspect. It managed to put much more feelings and much more emotions compared to this Godzilla vs Biollante. You also have in this film the introduction of Miki Segusa, who is a young girl who has some psychic power, and so is able to communicate or to feel the emotions of Godzilla. She will be a regular of the Heisei series, and I think she's a very good addition on the paper at the very least. It's a good idea to have somebody like this who is developing throughout the film of the series and who have some direct connection with Godzilla. Now, is she used as well as she should? Not exactly, and especially here, as it's just the start. I mean, she just has been created here, so she's introduced with Godzilla vs Biollante, and she doesn't have much to do, unfortunately, and that will be a problem during the rest of the series, that basically they have this great character and they don't manage to use it at its full potential. But anyway, it's a good idea, at least on paper, and she's a good addition to the roster of this Heisei saga. Judging by what I've said so far, you may be thinking, oh, so this Godzilla vs Biollante is not a good Godzilla. Actually, that's not the case. It's a pretty good film. It's one of the, I'm not sure, I was going top 5, maybe not that much, but at least in the top 10 Godzilla film. It's a pretty solid Godzilla entry, in my opinion. But it just had so much potential to be a great Godzilla that it is a bit frustrating and a bit disappointing that it doesn't really manage to go as far as it could. Having said that, there are some saving graces there, and the main saving grace of Godzilla vs Biollante is actually Biollante. It's a great kaiju, a great monster. It has two different forms. The first one is mostly vegetal, basically some kind of a monstrous giant rose with some tentacles. It looks pretty good. We have to really give it for the special effect crew, who did an amazing job. It's not easy to make a fight between a giant not mobile rose against Godzilla, to make this kind of fight dynamic, and they managed to make it quite convincing, which was really not a given. And it's convincing and it's really beautiful when it comes to the special effects. They did a great job. There was also a good inspiration. I'm not sure if it's from the director or the special effect crew, but the main fight happens during the night, so you have a bit of interesting lighting there. That really create a special atmosphere which helps to sell the fight, this titanic fight between Godzilla and Biollante. And then at the end of the film, you have the final form of Biollante, which is a mix of crocodile, Godzilla, and some kind of a carnivorous plant. And it may sound very weird to have this mix of different things, but actually the designer did an amazing job on this. Ultimate Biollante is just magnificent. It's a great work of design and of execution as well. I mean, the crew was able to make it convincing, and when you see it on the screen, it looks absolutely amazing, and you really fear for Godzilla in a way, because it looks massive as well. It's one of the very best kaiju that Toho ever created. It's just beautiful, and it leads to a very good fight, very well made, thanks to the special effects crew from Toho. And so that's a great climax for Godzilla Vs Biollante. The rest of the story was a bit messy, was a bit difficult sometimes to follow, and a bit clunky in its execution, but just thanks to this new kaiju, thanks to Biollante, it managed to save the day. At the same time, I should also mention that actually with this Godzilla vs Biollante, they finally correct and they finally get the things right when it comes to Godzilla eyes. So there is no longer this impression that he has some golf balls instead of eyes, and this time it really looks like convincing eyes. And so at this point, and from here until the very end of the Heisei era, this Godzilla is not really going to change. The design is basically set, and it's perfect. It's really a great design. Actually, I also like the design that will come up during the Millennium era, but this one is just top notch. It's exactly as Godzilla should be, and it will remain like this for the following episode, and for the best, in my opinion. So this Godzilla vs Biollante, very good Godzilla. A lot of problems, as I said, but the positive is still enough for you to have a good time and to be entertained watching this second episode of the Heisei era. Kazuki Omori came back in order to direct the third episode of the saga with Godzilla vs King Ghidorah, so made in 1991. King Ghidorah, who makes his big comeback. King Ghidorah, who is the nemesis of Godzilla, the big bad boss of the saga. And here we can already notice what will be a fairly general orientation of this Heisei era, which is basically from one film to another. They try to do something a bit new, and then they revert to something which was kind of known, which was tried and tested from the previous era. So with 1989, with Godzilla vs Biollante, they created a new monster. They tried to do things differently. Then with this Godzilla vs King Ghidorah, they're actually taking back a lot of elements from the Showa era. So we have King Ghidorah, obviously, but we have also some people. Here it's people who come from the future, but they basically look like the kind of extraterrestrial we had in the Godzilla of the 60s, like Invasion of the Astro Monster, these kind of things. So here we have those people from the future coming to Japan. Godzilla is starting to make a mess, and they inform them that in the future Godzilla will have destroyed all Japan. So they are coming from the future in order to help. They are suggesting to go back in time during the time of Second World War to remove the ancestor of Godzilla with a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So before it gets contaminated by radiation, by nuclear radiation. And so by removing it before that happens, then it removes Godzilla, and so Japan should enjoy peace and prosperity. So that's what they propose, that's what is done in the film, but it turns out that actually that's not the result. Having Godzilla disappear from this timeline actually brings another giant kaiju, King Ghidorah, and a King Ghidorah who has no enemy, who has no Godzilla to fight with, and who actually ends up destroying Japan. So it's actually a ploy from those people from the future to destroy Japan. So big influence here on this third episode from the Showa era, a certain amount of idea, of concept which were popular in the 60s are used here in a more modern and a more serious version, but still it's basically borrowed from the Showa era. At the same time, you can feel very clearly the American Hollywood influence. You have a cyborg here, a cyborg who looks very much like the Terminator, more like the Terminator 2. So a cyborg who is able to be also a nice guy. You also have a clear Jurassic Park influence. So you put all this in a shaker with the Showa era, with those Hollywood influence, and try to modernize the whole thing, and you have basically this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. You have the usual problem from those Godzilla films. Once again, the Western characters, the Western actors who are used here are not very convincing, and I'm especially thinking of the actor playing the cyborg. He just doesn't have the right face and attitude for that. It doesn't look like a convincing cyborg at all. I'm sure the guy is a very nice guy, and it certainly would be great to have a drink with him and to hear his stories about the making of the film, but as far as making a credible cyborg, that doesn't really work there. Still, the science fiction aspect was something I kind of liked in the Showa era. Actually, when you take the old Showa era films, if you put aside the original Godzilla, I already mentioned that the ones I prefer were those films, were the Godzilla films which assumed completely this science fiction orientation, with a spaceship, with extraterrestrial. And so you have a bit this vibe here. You have a gunfight with a laser rifle, these kind of things, and I kind of enjoyed that in this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. You also have King Ghidorah itself, who looks really good in this new version, especially as you have also a Mecha King Ghidorah at some point, once again looking really great. So once again, they really do a great job when it comes to the special effects and to modernizing the designs of those original characters from the Showa era. There is a lot of people who have complained on this episode, in general on the fights when it comes to the Heisei era, that it was basically spamming a laser, so it was a lot of laser fights. Actually, I don't have a problem with that. I don't think it's a problem at all. I kind of enjoy it because I'm not that fond with the Showa era tendency to basically transform the kaiju fight into wrestling, professional wrestling fights. So I rather prefer this version with indeed a lot of projectile, laser, atomic breath, whatever. But I find it more interesting, and you also have some physical fight as well. But I think the combination of both creates much more dynamic fights between the kaiju, and so I completely support what Kazuki Omori and the other directors in the series did there. I think that was the right thing to do, and so I'm not on this line that there are just too many laser and things like this. I think that's actually for the best when it comes to the fight. Now, what is in a way interesting but also problematic with this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah is actually the political message, because there is a political message here. And the message is basically one of anti-Americanism. Okay, so why am I saying that? Because basically the people from the future are Westerners, and they clearly are shown as like a representation of the US. So the US, who is jealous of the prosperity, of the success of Japan. And why is it like this? It's because back in the end of the 80s, early 90s, that was indeed the case. There was a big anti-Japanese, anti-Japan tendency in the US. There was a huge fear of Japan taking over the US. You have to remember that the 80s was really the time where there was a huge economic development in Japan. They were buying a lot of companies all over the world, including in the US. And so there was this kind of reaction from the US against Japan, which led to movies being made like Robocop 3 with the ninja robot, with films like, I think it's Red Son with Wesley Snipes and Sean Connery. So this kind of films, Black Rain as well, which were extremely critical of Japan, and in reality that led to the American government putting a lot of pressure on the Japanese government and to change some of their policy, especially monetary policy, and that actually led to the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble and then stagnation for like the 30 years which follow. So there was indeed during that time some kind of jealousy and rivalry from the US towards Japan, and that led indeed Japan to have to do things which they probably would not have done under normal circumstances. And so there is some validity here in the reaction of the Japanese filmmakers, the Japanese scriptwriter, to be critical toward the US. So on that part, I think it's justified and it has some validity. The problem with this message is that it's also linked with Second World War. So basically, there is a link which is made here between the US trying to constrain Japan in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and like being the same as what the US did during the 30s, 40s, during the Second World War. And I think this analysis, this parallel is extremely dubious. I think there is some validity in the claim that what the US did to Japan during the 90s was not really the right thing to do, but there is no validity to the claim that Japan was doing good during the 30s and 40s when they were invading a good part of Asia and trying to colonize different areas and killing a lot of people in the process. I mean, that was awful, and even if you try to justify it, even if you use the concept of the sphere of co-prosperity, this kind of concept that they were trying to put forward, it doesn't have much value, and honestly, it's a good thing that Japan was stopped in those attempts. So I think this parallel here is really not proper. It is really not justified. And so that makes the political message of this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah very awkward, in my opinion, and certainly not valid. And that's one of the main problems of this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah in my eyes. You have the classical flaws of Godzilla film, the same way as it was in Godzilla vs Biollante. So once again, characters who are just functions, who don't really have personality of their own, and which have dialogues which lacks any natural delivery. I don't know why you also have a writer character played by a man, and I guess he must have been extremely popular as an idol in Japan around that time, because it seems like half of the time in the film he is half naked, always showing his body and things like this. Doesn't really feel natural at all for a writer. But anyway, that's kind of classical Godzilla problem, and we will find them again and again from one film to the other. So at the end, this Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, I think, is one level below Godzilla vs Biollante or Return of Godzilla. It's not bad. There is enough positive, once again, for you to have an entertaining time watching it. But there is certainly many things which are also really criticizable and which are not that subtle and doesn't deliver the right message, in my opinion. So by now the production rhythm has considerably increased, and the year after, 1992, we got the fourth episode of the Heisei era, which is Godzilla vs Mothra, directed by Takao Okawara, so no longer Kazuo Omori, and Takao Okawara, who will become the the main director basically of the Heisei era, the one who ends up doing the most of them. And I already mentioned with the previous film that there was a tendency by that point to try to recycle, to reuse what had been popular from the Showa era. And with this one, it's even more obvious because we have the return of Mothra. So Mothra, one of the most charismatic to Kaiju after King Ghidorah, or about the same level, I would say, as King Ghidorah. So they brought King Ghidorah the film before, so here, of course, they bring Mothra. Makes sense. In a movie which is very similar to what had been done in the 60s with the original Mothra versus Godzilla. The difference here is that we have a bit of Indiana Jones vibe, especially during the first third of the film. Once again, I guess that was the trend on the Hollywood influence being at play here. There was already this kind of adventure spirit in some of the Godzilla of the Showa era. So once again, it recycled some other elements from the previous era of the Godzilla saga. It does work. It's fairly entertaining to see them being on those islands, discovering these civilizations and stuff. It's pretty predictable, but it's done with enough professionalism that you end up having a fairly good time watching it. They did try to bring something a bit new to the equation with creating a new Kaiju whose name here is Batra. The Batra is basically an evil version of Mothra. Pretty good design, but it's still like the dark version of Mothra. So there is not much novelty when it comes to this new Kaiju or the design. It's well made. There is obviously a great professionalism in the Toho special effects design team, and they do a great job, no problem there. But I think it's not really enough to really make this new Godzilla vs Mothra that much more interesting compared to the original from the 60s. And when it comes to recycling also the elements from the Showa era, we also have a more ecological message here, which was something which had also developed during the Showa era in the last footing of the series, so during the end of the 60s, during the 70s, with films like Godzilla vs Ghidorah. And so we find again this ecological message here with Godzilla vs Mothra, which makes sense because Mothra is usually the incarnation of the nature of Gaia, of the spirit of the earth in its more harmonious way. So it makes sense to have it also included here. So all in all, it's a fairly professional, competently made Godzilla film, but it's just too predictable. I mean, there are too many elements which are directly taken from the classics of the 60s, and there is not enough originality, and so entertaining enough, but nothing which really stands out the test of time, or which will really have a very strong impression in your mind. Fortunately, things would improve with the following one, so the number 5, which is Godzilla vs MechaGodzilla II, directed once again by Takao Okawara, and which, in my opinion, is one of the very best Godzilla film. So what happens here? We have a team of scientists who discover a giant egg, which is the object of a fight between Godzilla and Rodan. They managed to bring the egg to Japan, and it turns out that it was an egg of Godzilla, and we have a new small Godzilla, a new mini-Zilla. who looks much more convincing and much more interesting than the MechaGodzilla we got from the 60s. But of course, bringing it to Japan, it also brings Godzilla to Japan as well as Rodan. And in order to face this threat, humanity has developed a new mecha, being in this case MechaGodzilla, by using the technology that had been brought from the future with Mecha King Ghidorah. They managed to create a new robot, a giant robot, a MechaGodzilla, and they are going to confront Godzilla with this new machine. As you already probably know by then, you already I've already stated it quite a few times that I think it is much better when humanity is able to do something against Godzilla, to be active. And so transforming MechaGodzilla, who in the Showa era was a creature, a robot used by bad guys, transforming it into a tool for the human to fight, a weapon to fight against Godzilla, I think is a great idea. And actually, that's an idea which will remain for all the future incarnation of MechaGodzilla. And it comes up, it was brought up for the first time here with Godzilla vs MechaGodzilla II. And I think it's a great idea. An aspect of that which I actually enjoy too is that we have a fairly international team handling this MechaGodzilla. There is, for example, a Western woman who is part of the team who is driving the MechaGodzilla. She's kind of in the background. I mean, most of the actors, the main people in this MechaGodzilla team are obviously Japanese. Makes sense, it's a Japanese production. But at least there was an effort to give a bit of an international vibe there as well, and that's something which I appreciate. And so having this team of people having to learn how to drive this MechaGodzilla, having to fight against Godzilla in their machine, it brings a bigger emphasis, I think, on the characters, on the character development. And this time they feel a little bit less wooden compared to human characters from the previous film of the Heisei era. And so there is an improvement there. It's not perfect, far from it. They still are a bit awkward. I mean, it doesn't flow as naturally as it should, but there is some effort which have been made, and I think it does benefit the film. There is also an effort which has been made on the character of MechaGodzilla, who, if you remember, the Showa era was a complete disaster. That's not the case here. He's actually fairly convincing, and you kind of relate with it, and you kind of believe in the burgeoning relationship that there is between the human who are in charge of him, and so him kind of taking a liking to them as well. It works pretty well. It doesn't fall into the trap of making MechaGodzilla really too much like a baby or like a human, and so there is still this animal side to it, but it's still relatable enough, and it works fairly well. That's really to the big advantage of the film. And also, obviously, which by that point had become a given in the series, you have great special effect scene, you have great fight between Godzilla and MechaGodzilla. That's the great thing with MechaGodzilla, as he has a lot of weapon. There is a lot of surprise, there is a lot of novelty. The predictability factor is less present when MechaGodzilla is here, in my opinion, because you never really know what gadget he's going to use, and they have been quite creative with that, and he has always new things to use against Godzilla, and so that makes for very dynamic and very well made fights. The only complaint I could have when it comes to the special effects maybe is on Rodan. I think Rodan is a little bit less convincing, especially when it's flying. The The special effects when it's flying is a bit funky, not the best that they have come up with, but it is really a minor flaw, and in general, when it comes to the special effects scenes, they are really a great job by the Toho team. So as you can see, I'm fairly enthusiastic about this Godzilla vs MechaGodzilla II. It's for me the very best film of the Heisei era. It's one of the very best Godzilla film, just period. So really I would advise you strongly to watch it. Given that the Heisei era has continuity from one film to another, it would be better if you watch from the Return of Godzilla from Godzilla 1984. But in any case, you should have a look to this great Godzilla vs MechaGodzilla II. Then in 1994, Takao Okawara takes a break, and the new Godzilla is given to another director, who is Kensho Yamashita, and Kensho Yamashita so makes Godzilla vs Spacegodzilla. Godzilla vs Spacegodzilla, there are basically two storylines in parallel. On one side, you have the J-Force, who is developing a Project T, a project to control, to communicate and to control Godzilla, and for that they are using the psychic ability of Miki Segusa, and they are also using the the Minizilla in order to achieve that result. So now we have two Godzilla. The Minizilla of Godzilla vs MechaGodzilla II is still there. As I said, that's the characteristic, that's the specificity of the Heisei era, that there is continuity from one film to another. But at the same time, you also have a new threat coming to space, because there have been some Godzilla cells which have been sent into space through Mothra, if I remember correctly. Cells which have mutated with Biollante as well, and who have mutated again when they have encountered a black hole, and it has given birth to a new giant monster that is Spacegodzilla. And Spacegodzilla is heading to Earth. He actually arrived in Japan, he captured Minizilla, and so Godzilla has to rescue his son from the clutch of this space version of himself. So compared to the other film from the Heisei era, this Godzilla vs Spacegodzilla is a little bit more kid-friendly. It doesn't go as far as the Showa era, trying to make everything cute and trying to really appeal to the kids. But it's still a bit more family friendly, I would say, compared to the previous episode. The design of Minizilla has been a bit changed compared to MechaGodzilla 2. They try to make it looks a bit more kawaii there. They don't go as far as copying what was done during the Showa era, fortunately, but clearly the idea was to make it a bit more appealing for either kids or maybe the female audience, I'm not sure. But that was clearly the intention, to make it more family friendly, basically. The good idea when it comes to the story is to try to have Miki Segusa really being involved in the forefront of the film, in the forefront of the story. At this point, the actress has been here already for 4 films, and that's really the first one where she finally gets to do more interesting things. It's still not to the full level that we could expect. There are still many secondary characters who tend to overshadow her. Secondary characters who are a bit on the comedy side as well, which makes sense in the general orientation of this new Godzilla, but which is a bit disappointing, I think, because it should have been really concentrating on Miki Segusa. I think she had proven her worth well enough, and she had been there physically enough in the previous movie, so that now we could really go full development with her and really make it a character with more richness. But unfortunately, the film on that aspect is still a mixed result. The story itself, when it comes to the new Kaiju, the Space Godzilla, is quite limited. There is not much really new. As I said, he just capture, kidnap Minizilla, and there is a fight going there. There is really not much in this new Kaiju, but I think the saving grace is once again the great work made by the Toho team with its design. They managed to make the original Godzilla design even more aggressive. I kind of like the way they use the crystal in his shoulders, and the good idea also which comes with it is that when he comes on Earth and he starts fighting, he starts creating his own environment. So once Godzilla reach him, you have a kind of devastated city, which, if I remember correctly, is Fukuoka, which is nice to see Fukuoka being in the saga, in the Godzilla saga. And so all around him, he has created a lot of different crystal, and so it makes for very science fiction, very strong imagery landscape here, and it brings a bit more originality than just having the two Kaiju fighting in a city, in a normal city. It brings something a bit unreal, but in a good way. And I really appreciate that they try to do that. It feels a bit like in Aliens, when you are with the Queen, or just when the aliens have created their own nest. It brings a more interesting, otherworldly quality to it, which is a bit similar here in Godzilla vs Spacegodzilla, and that makes for the fight a bit more interesting than if it was just the two Kaiju fighting against each other. Interestingly too, instead of having a Return of MechaGodzilla here, they chose to have another mecha, another giant robot, and it's Moguera. So Moguera, who is also taken from the Toho gallery of robot and monsters. So it's quite nice to see him here, even if from a design point of view, I think MechaGodzilla is much more impressive, but still it's a nice nod, and they kind of reuse the concept from MechaGodzilla 2 of having a team of human driving it, and so being involved in the event, and so that puts the human a bit more in the forefront of the story compared to some of the previous Godzilla, but it's basically a rehash of what had been done in MechaGodzilla 2. So all in all, this Space Godzilla, is decent. It's not a bad entry, but it's certainly a minor one. Entertaining enough, you won't have a bad time watching it, but it's also of all the Heisei era, most likely the most forgettable of the series. And it leads us to the final installment of this Heisei era, that is Godzilla vs Destroyah, made in 1995 by Takao Okawara. So the return of Takao Okawara, the usual director in a way of the Heisei era, which is the last Godzilla of this series, and which was supposedly the end of the Japanese Godzilla. We have here a Godzilla who has become radioactive himself. He's basically imploding. It's like he has a fission, a nuclear fission in his body happening. So he's basically a walking Chernobyl, and is going to explode at some point. So he is at the very end of his life. But at the same time, we realize that the oxygen destroyer, which had been used in the original Godzilla, had some side effects which were not planned, and it had actually created some other mutation. It's created a new monster, first in some human form, a human-sized monster, but who ends up being able to transform into a giant version, and that leads to the existence of what is supposedly the ultimate Kaiju, the ultimate monster of the Toho Kaiju verse, that is a Destroyer. First, I must say that I really enjoy the opening of Godzilla vs Destroyah because Godzilla is doing a bit of tourism in Hong Kong. So we see him next to the Jumbo, we see him in the Victoria Harbour, all these emblematic places of Hong Kong. It's interesting to see Godzilla being there, given that at the time, basically Hong Kong was at its apex when it comes to influence. There were quite a few Hong Kong-Japan co-production being made around that time, and I think it seems like a nod from the Japanese producer and filmmakers to the influence that Hong Kong had on themselves, and so that I think it's a nice gesture there, especially also when you know that around the same time or little bit later, you had some filmmakers, Hong Kong filmmakers, also thinking about to do a Godzilla of their own. And here I'm thinking of Choi Ark, who had this plan for a long time, who is a big fan of Godzilla. So it's quite fun to see Godzilla in Hong Kong in the opening of Godzilla vs Destroyah. Even if the geography of Hong Kong is completely messed up, it makes absolutely no sense. But it's often like this once you have foreign filmmakers doing things in Hong Kong. They don't really care about the real geography, and it can be argued actually that sometimes Hong Kong filmmakers don't even care about the real geography either. So fair game there. And then we have the rest of story, which develop a story which makes a lot of nods and references to the original 1954 Ishiro Honda Godzilla. So we have the Oxygen Destroyer, we have some characters who are related to the characters of the original. There is also Akira Ifukube, the composer of the original Godzilla, who agreed to come back on this one and who makes for some very good tracks, especially at the very end. So there is a lot of respect being shown by this Godzilla vs Destroyah towards the original, toward the very first Godzilla film, and that's a good thing. I mean, if you have enjoyed the original, if you have been able to go through the whole series, it's nice to see this kind of nods of respect being shown. Less convincing is the presence of a genius, a young teenager who is a genius and who is going to help the J-Force in their struggle against the Kaiju. That's typically the kind of bad idea which probably comes from the executive, thinking that they need to appeal to the younger audience, so they try to throw some younger characters, and I don't think it works very well. I mean, it actually makes the film even less realistic. Of course, Godzilla films are not the most realistic there is, but still you cannot go too far on that aspect. And with this kind of genius who are able to come up with great idea, much better than like the best scientist of all Earth, it's a bit hard to swallow. The suspension of disbelief is pretty hard to have when you have this kind of characters. But at least this one is not too annoying. It's kind of acceptable. Still, I think it would have been better if it had been written another way, if it had been made into someone maybe a bit older. But it's not a big flaw, at least. As we have seen from the previous Heisei films, there are often been a big influence from Hollywood, and there is once again an Hollywood influence in Godzilla vs Destroyah, and that's especially oriented, I think, towards James Cameron Aliens, with the way we discover the destroyer, the small destroyer. All these sequences are trying to be a bit Aliens-like the second one, not the first one by Ridley Scott, which is not a bad idea, actually. That's especially interesting because around the same time you will have the second Gamera, which will try something a bit similar with better success, I think, with the better result, because the problem in Godzilla vs Destroyer is the animatronic of the small destroyer. It's a good thing that they try to make them at real size, and I'm sure they put a lot of effort, but they are not super convincing. I mean, you can see that they don't really move very quickly or move at all. They are a bit stiff, and so it's difficult to make them as convincing creature and convincing opponents during those aliens-inspired scene. So that's one flaw there, where it seems like the Toho special effects team is starting to reach its limit. Fortunately, things are much better once we have them as a real kaiju with the final Destroyer form. You have to admit that Destroyer is a pretty impressive kaiju. I mean, he's huge. He has a lot of features. He looks really like a super menacing, super aggressive kaiju, someone who indeed has the possibility, has the capacity to just get rid of Godzilla. And so he is an interesting addition to the Toho kaiju world. Having said that, each time I'm seeing it, I must confess, I always have the impression that they have tried to overdo it. It seems like there are just too many things going on in its design, and it's lacking maybe a clear focus. Sometimes I'm not a great designer myself. I think you can see it through the thumbnails I'm doing for this video. I'm not very good at it, so I'm not in a very strong position to criticize the designer from Toho. They certainly would do much better than me, but sometimes keeping things a bit more simple is to the advantage. And I think here with Destroyer, they really tried to, they clearly wanted to do the ultimate bad kaiju, and I think they overdo the design in a way, and it becomes just too much. It's too full of things, and at the end you are a bit distracted by all these features. And in a way I would have preferred if they had kept it maybe a little bit more simple, but it's really a small criticism there from me, and still it looks super impressive when you see it on the screen, and it makes for a very powerful battle, this ultimate battle with Godzilla, especially as Godzilla, as I said, is kind of self-imploding. You have a very interesting glow of light, this very red glow that he has throughout the film, and it makes for something very graphic, very strong image for Godzilla, which is really beautiful to watch. And so the combination of this self-imploding Godzilla fighting this very impressive kaiju in Destroyer, it's really a strong visual presence there during the whole final of the film. And that leads to the end of Godzilla, to the death of Godzilla during a sequence which is very good, with a beautiful track from Akira Ifukube there, and it's really, really touching. It's actually a very good conclusion to the whole Godzilla series, even if we know that actually there will be further Godzilla after. When you watched it at the time, and even when you are watching it now, even knowing that, it still makes for a very touching scene, which was not a given. I mean, feeling touched by the death of Godzilla, it's not necessarily that easy to create this empathy and to create something which you can really relate to. But Takao Okawara and his team already managed there, and so that makes for a very good conclusion to the Heisei era, this ending, this death of Godzilla. And so this Godzilla vs Destroyer has a lot of qualities, a few flaws there and there, but it's still a very strong conclusion to the Heisei era, and a good Godzilla film on its own standards as well. And that's it for the Heisei era of Godzilla, one of the most interesting era of the Godzilla series in my opinion, one which has the classical Godzilla flaws, but which has also a lot of qualities, a lot of things done right, and which makes for a fairly pleasant, even if sometimes slightly frustrating viewing experience. So I really recommend you to watch the whole film. I mean, with only 7 of them, it's fairly easy to go through the whole series, and there is a consistency of tone also in general, which is to the benefit of the film and which makes it less of a roller coaster of quality that was the Showa era. So strong recommendation for the whole series. If you don't want to bother with all of them, I would especially advise at least to watch the Return of Godzilla, so Godzilla 1984, and the Godzilla Vs MechaGodzilla II, and maybe also check the Godzilla Vs Destroyah. So the 3 main ones which you should watch are those ones. Some of the very best Godzilla film, in my opinion. As usual, I hope you found this retrospective interesting. I hope you learned maybe a new way to look at those films, a few more information you were not necessarily aware of. I remind you that if you appreciate the video and appreciate the work I'm doing, please don't hesitate to support the channel by commenting, by sharing the video, or by participating financially on the tipeee of the channel. All the links are in the description. Any help you can provide will be greatly appreciated. And I will see you again on the last part of this retrospective, the third and last part of this retrospective, which will cover the Millennium era, the most recent Godzilla film on the American versions of the Godzilla series. Until then, watch a lot of films and take care.